in Arizona. Hope you're having a super fantastic sparkling day. Welcome to Before the Dirt Nap podcast number 1824, Deeds. We are now 2 sleeps away from celebrating 5 years of doing this daily. So hope you can join us on Wednesday, the 31st of July. Jeepers, we're already at the end of July. Whoo! On the 31st of July, as we celebrate the last day of 5 years of doing this live. What are we going to do on the 1st of August when we start year 6? I don't know. I'm still trying to figure that one out. We may continue as we are. We may make a change. I don't know. We made a change, was it last year or the year before, to Before the Dirt Nap, from Helen's Great Adventures to Before the Dirt Nap. Actually, I think we've known Before the Dirt Nap now for 2 years. Before that, it was Helen's Great Adventures. So anything could happen. So make a note to come join us. It's going to be awesome. We're going to have Casey here. And it's gonna be a fun evening. It's gonna be a fun podcast. We've got Casey coming on. Anytime Casey comes on, we have a lot of fun. But anyway, tonight we're talking about deeds. What are deeds? These are pieces of paper that show whether or not you show that you own a property. It could be, of property that you own. And going back in time, we're going to go back in time. When you're looking at deed records for your ancestors, you got to be we're going to just talk about 2 things that you have to be aware of. One of them is that when the deed was recorded, the clerk had the job of transcribing the deed, and he would have to do it exactly as it was written. He had to put it into their book or whatever they were using to record the deed. So to record the deed, he had to copy exactly what was written. And sometimes they came across, because it was normally a male that did this, he came across mistakes. Well, should he correct those mistakes or not? Absolutely not, because his job was to copy it exactly as written. So what he would do is, if he came across an error, and it could be where he noted it was an error, like it turned around and might say that he signed when it was actually a couple that signed. So instead of putting they put he. Or it could be that there was a word or a phrase that looked wrong, even though they're copying it directly across. They cannot make any changes. It has to be exact. Every word has to be exactly copied across. So what he would do is he would put an underline under the word to show that he did not make an error, that the clerk did not make an error when he was transcribing. It shows that that's as it was on the actual deed. So that's one thing to look for. If you see underlines on anything on a deed record, then just know that they have copied that exactly as it was, but the clerk picked up an error. It could have been a spelling error. It could have been the fact that they used he instead of they or she. It could be that the phrase didn't sound right to the clerk, so he underlined it. There's a number of reasons that they would have underlined it, and that was just to show that the clerk did not make the mistake when transcribing. He transcribed exactly as it was written, and the error was already on the original deed. Now, here's something else about the deeds. Sorry, I got a tickle in my throat tonight. So here's something else about the deeds, which I thought was very interesting. Recording deeds were delayed. There was delays in recording deeds in the 19th century and before. Today, it's very quick on recording deeds, so there's not much of a problem. But, and this I got off a genealogy tip of the day, they said that today deeds are recorded fairly soon after their execution. That was not the case in the 19th century and before. It was not uncommon for deeds to be recorded several months or longer after they were signed. Now, on one of my genealogy classes that I did, was it last? No, it wasn't last year, it was the year before. We were looking at land records and deeds and things like that. And some of them weren't just months after, they were years after the execution of the deed. And that came around because they may have found the deed tucked away, and somebody had passed away. They found the deed tucked in with this person's papers and everything else, and realized it had not been recorded. So then they had to go and record it so they could then do the execution of the will and the property changes, or sell the property, or things like that as well. Now, this is something else that was very interesting in the same thing. The risk of a person, the risk a person took is in losing their deed before it was recorded. So they could have actually lost their deed, as the recorded copy serves as the legal equivalent of the original if it was lost. So if they haven't recorded the deed and they go and lose their deed, they have no comeback. They have no record that this ever took place. And deeds that were recorded decades after the fact were frequently recorded then because the purchaser wanted to property or and remember deeds are recorded in order in which they are brought to the records office, not in the order they were executed. So you could go to you may find all these bits of paper and you find the deeds in there from the from the ancestors and things. So you go to and realize it hadn't been recorded. You go to record it and you can't record it because you no longer own that property. Somebody else may have come in and recorded a deed for that property, and now you're out of a property. So it was in the landowner's best interest to record the deeds quickly. But of course, that was not always the case because of maybe where they lived and where they had to go to record. Could be, it could be a day or two's journey, and so it got put off until the next time they were going to town. And you hear these things back in the ancestors' days where they were going to town. Going to town meant being gone for 2 to 3 days in some cases, based on where they were because of where their property was and where the nearest town was. It was a 2 to 3 day journey to get there. Or it could have been a day to get there, a day shopping, and then a day to get back home again. Just because of the distance that they had to go to the nearest town that had whatever it was they wanted, including the clerk's office where they had to go and record the deed. So you sometimes get things that were like, oh, we need to do this next time we go to town, and they may have forgotten to take the papers with them. They may have put them away, tucked them away, and totally forgotten about it, and may not even have thought about it. And then later on when they pass away, their heirs are now going through their papers to see what do we have to do, how do we, where's the will, let's go through the paperwork, and they find the deeds that have not been recorded. And so now they've got to go in and record those deeds so they can now turn around and sell the property if that's the case, or be able to record the new deeds of the fact that they have now inherited this property. The people's names have changed. So there's all sorts of stuff that you can find when you are. So if you do find some deeds, you may find that they were recorded years after the actual event. Unfortunately, nobody else had come in the meantime and had purchased the property and recorded their deed first. Or stolen it from underneath people, made up some deed documents or something, and swindled the people out of their land. You never know. And it's interesting because I've been watching a lot of historic British TV shows that were set in historical times, historical times, jeepers, back in the 50s, the 60s, the 30s, the 40s, at time periods like that. And even watching classic movies, because it brings up a lot of questions when you look at it from a genealogy perspective. It's sort of like, but even when you think about some of the stuff that they're looking at, like, well, how do they know that that kid is the kid they're looking for? They can't DNA test them. All they have is just somebody say so that this is the picture of the kid, of the child that they're looking for. And, this stuff seems to line up. All these facts seem to line up. Like one of them, it was about a 30-year case of a 30-year-old unsolved case of missing children. There was 2 boys that were missing. They found the remains of one, and this is a fictional British crime series. They found the remains of one of the boys in a mine shaft. Now, how did they know that that was one of the missing boys? Simply because they looked at the belongings that were there. They got the parents to come in and identify the belongings that they found with the body. Now, was that actually their son that was there and those belongings were actually his? Or was it the fact that his belong? And I'm sitting there thinking, okay, yes, you've got the belongings. You've got that plane he always used to walk around with and take with him everywhere, was found with the remains. But are those actually his remains? Could it be the other child that was missing, and all of their son's remains were actually left with the other children, with the other child? So there was all this sort of questions coming up in my mind. How do they know? And then they find out, they find this guy 30 years, they found the other child 30 years later. But because they arrested him for doing stuff he shouldn't have been doing, and they put the pieces together to figure out that he was the other missing child, and he had actually survived. And then he tells the story about how the other kid died, the other boy died, and what had happened with that. So I'm just like thinking from a genealogy perspective, how do they know that that child is the child they're looking for? How do they know those remains are what they're looking for? DNA testing would have been really good at back then. And this police officer on one of the episodes just found his mistress killed. And so he's busy like, what do I do? And he can't report the crime because then they'll be asking, because he was married, what are you doing here? And so, of course, he then had to go around and wipe his fingerprints off everything because he had been in the room many times. So he's busy wiping off fingerprints and all that and making sure he sneaks out, that nobody saw him when he snuck out and things like that. And he had actually just given this mistress a beautiful necklace, and he couldn't find the necklace in the room. And he's like, well, it turns out he gets home and he's still in shock about finding his mistress murdered. And he gets home and his wife is talking to him, and she pulls back the bed covers to get into bed, and there's this jewelry box, there's this little velvet box sitting there, and they open it up and it's the missing necklace. So somebody obviously knew who he was and what he was doing and things like that. But that's just all fictional. But if you look at it in a different perspective of what if this was a real case? What if this actually happened? And there's probably cases like that out there, because sometimes stories are taken from real life events. That's how some writers come up with things. They take headlines from the news and create a whole story around it. So maybe there was missing boys back in the 1920s. These boys went missing. Maybe there were a couple of boys that went missing in the 1920s, and that was kind of loosely the story around it. So you got to think of these things, and just think of all sorts of things. I'm sitting there going, well, can't they just? No, they can't do DNA testing. It wasn't around at that time. So mistakes are made along the way, but when you're looking at deeds, if you're looking for deed records, you might say, oh, well, they actually purchased that property in 1860 is when they got married, and that's when they were given the property. And you're looking for records in 1860s for the deed of this property that they were gifted. You might have to look a few years later, a few months later, a few years later to find that record of that transaction that happened back in 1860. So just keep that in mind when you're looking for deeds and other information regarding your ancestors, what happened around that time. And also to be aware that a lot of countries and places did not have requirements for recording births, deaths, and marriages. It was all done in the church level and the parish records. So there weren't actually any official like birth certificates, death certificates, marriage certificates. Those were all done in the parish. So another place that you can go and look. In fact, it wasn't until it was quite late, like early 1900s, I think it was. I'm trying to remember again, when federal law was passed here in the US, of when they had to when they were legally required to record births, deaths, and marriages with the county, with the city, the county, the state, the government, whatever entity that they proclaimed at the time. But it was like early 1900s. I think it was like around the I can't remember the year. I know it was early 1900s. It was like just recent as far as genealogy goes. Some countries were back in the 1800s, they required that. The US was like early 1900s. So just be, but one way that you can, so it's just like, well, how do we find this information? How do we know when they started recording things? If you go to familysearch.org and look at their research wiki and put in this, if you look at here in the States, put in the state that you're researching or the country that you're researching, they actually have a really cool resource there where you can go and you can look up, and they will actually put that records in this place when birth, deaths, and marriage records didn't come around until this year, and it could be different years for each one: birth, deaths, marriages, deeds, that sort of stuff. Everything. It will tell you when they had to start recording them legally, started recording them, like mandated by the federal government, as when records had to start being kept. So if you go to the research wiki, look up the state that you're looking at, it will tell you when that state officially started recording births, deaths, and marriages, and it could be different years for each one. They may not all have been started in the same year. For deeds, you can have a look. They'll have information on where to look for deeds as well. And just remember, because it was in the 1800s or earlier, those deeds may not have been recorded till days, weeks, months, years after the transaction took place. So that's just a little bit on deeds. And I liked that when I came across about the underlining of the errors. I thought that explains why when I've looked up some deed records, I see the little underline thing. I'm like, why is that underlined? There's only certain words that are underlined, not the whole thing. I didn't know about the fact that they were underlining errors. So I thought that was a very cool, handy thing to know. So if you see those little underlines in there, look at because they're copying it exactly as it's written on the deed. Have a look and see, because it could be that they may have put he or she instead of they, because it could have been two people that signed the deed as co-owners, and yet they've only put a he or maybe a she on the original deed when it should have been a they. Or they may have put they and there's only one signature on there as well. So it works in reverse as well. So have a look for those underlines. Also, to just remember that the time difference between when executed to when recorded could be a very lengthy time. So if you can't find them in the year that you know that they got given that property, or that somewhere in the records it says they got given that as a wedding gift, it could be weeks, months, years after they got married that the deed was recorded. So just keep that in the back of your mind when you're researching deeds. And I'll tell you, there's interesting information that you can find on deeds, but we're going to save that conversation for another day. Go out, have a super fantastic sparkling evening. We'll catch you guys back here tomorrow evening